Well, welcome to not Shaco, Mississippi this morning. We're going to be about 1,000 miles away from Shaco. You happen to be at Virginia Beach, Virginia, at the home of our son, Dr. Jim Ritchie, and his family, who have just moved into their new digs here in Virginia Beach. We missed all the bad weather in Canton this week, but we were fortunate that the power came back on very quickly because our across the street neighbor still does not have power today, and so they're staying at our house, which is kind of interesting that it worked out this way. We're delighted that we were able to help them. But our son Jim here, whom you're looking at, was a doctor in the Navy, retired from the Navy after 25 years as a Navy doctor, and then spent 7 years after retirement. He and his family moved as missionaries to Kenya, Africa. Been back, what, a couple of years now, buddy?
And couple of years.
Is now engaged in some activities that he'll talk about, but he and I were talking not too long ago, and there's believe it or not, similarities between problems that have been run into by Navy doctors in combat, which he has been in, two soirees over to Afghanistan, and then the problems run into by doctors in missionary work. So I'm going to let him sort of explain some of those things that we talked about, and I'll shut up for a few minutes. You then won't hear me, and let him talk about some of those things, buddy. Why don't you run through some of the things that we chatted about, and let's.
All right, we'll see where it goes. See where the Lord leads. I just thought that it was important to realize how critical it is to people that we are spiritual beings and not just mechanical beings, and how that really has a direct effect on us when we're really engaged in trial. So when I was in Afghanistan, the second time in particular, we were really well trained to be over there as medics. So we had great training in the United States at baseline, and then we were also trained in England specifically about the role we were going to, the hospital we were going to, and clinically we were very well prepared. We were even really well prepared for the horrors of war. They had a simulation there where they really simulated some of the things that we were going to encounter. What we were not prepared for were the moral, ethical, spiritual crises that we were going to encounter. So, I mean, it's one thing to see all the terrors of war, the people who were burned up, shot up, and blown up, and men, women, and children, and that sort of a thing. But also just the ethical crises that were going on over there. They were very difficult for many of us to wrestle with, especially when we weren't sure what was the right thing to do. And sometimes when we chose what to do, we chose the right thing, and sometimes we inadvertently chose the wrong thing. How do you live with that, especially when it's life and death? We were later introduced to the concept of moral injury, and that was used to describe the soldiers initially. When you do something, or you're party to something, or you didn't prevent something that violates your deeply held moral values, it can produce a moral injury. And sometimes that happens when you deliberately do something, like when someone loses control, and like if a soldier loses control. And that generally wasn't the case with us so much. It was because we didn't do things intentionally to harm somebody. But sometimes you find yourself in that situation, and you're just not sure what's the right thing to do. Like, for instance, as happened a lot in a lot of places in Afghanistan, not everywhere, but in a lot of places with tribal Islam, if a woman or an older girl was injured and was brought to the hospital, they would inevitably be brought with a male family member who would decide whether that person was going to receive care where we were or not. So there were a fair number of women that when they saw that there were men working in the hospital, they said, she cannot be treated. Leave her outside. Because otherwise, in that culture, if a woman is seen unclothed by a man, a woman or an older girl, then she is dishonored. And if the family receives her back in that state, no one will trade with that family in the future. No one will intermarry with that. So the women will be killed instead of received back dishonored. So the men were there to be sure that their women were not dishonored in that way. So what do you do? What do you do? You're there, and a woman is brought in, and she is seriously injured. She needs surgery, or she's going to die. And the male family member says, "Nope, there are men in the hospital here, and I'm not going to allow that." So, do you say, "Okay, your decision, take her away," or do you say, "No, we're going to treat her anyway and bring her in, and if they decide to kill her later, well, that's blood on their head, not blood on my head." Do you do that? Or do you come up with a system that deceives him so that he thinks everything is good to go, but actually, if you only have male surgeons, which is what we had, that you know that she'll be taken care of, but he won't realize that she was taken care of by men. But that's a deliberate deception. It's a lie. So what do you do? Those really are your choices. And I'm not going to tell you what we did, but there were those things, Or what do you do in a situation where there were some people who were really extensively burned, and if they were Americans, they would get full court press and be brought back to America almost with any extent of burn. Well, what do you do with an Afghan? Because we didn't bring the Afghans back to the States, and we also only had a limited amount of time that we could treat them in our hospital before we needed to move them back into the Afghan medical system. Because people who are seriously, extensively burned in that system, they don't have burn centers over there. So those people uniformly died if they had more than 50% body surface area burns. So what do? Do you treat them differently from Americans from the outset? So anyway, those sorts of things were going on, and we were not prepared for those. And a lot of people came back different or pretty beat up emotionally, spiritually, that sort of thing.
You're talking about the doctors?
Yeah, the medics, right, in particular, right. Doctors, nurses, techs, X-ray techs, anybody who was involved in that system and realizing, okay, I'm part of a system that is having to make these decisions, and we're not sure whether they're right or not. And again, you can't make every decision perfectly. Sometimes you're right, and sometimes you're not. And sometimes when it's not, there were serious consequences of that. And I found a similar situation when we were doing healthcare missions, in that we were well clinically prepared, but the moral, ethical, spiritual, theological things tended not to be so addressed. In the old days, like the 1800s, when they sent healthcare missionaries, often they were required to have theological degrees. They had to go to full seminary and that sort of a thing. And these days, it turns out that, especially with medics, there's just so much training that's needed for that.
But let me interrupt just a second.
Go.
Before we get into the missions part, when you got back from Afghanistan, you were trying to get some of the higher ups in the Navy educated to that difficulty you were talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you wrote a paper, right?
Well, mainly we wrote a few things, but it was mainly just giving talks on combat medicine ethics and power, vulnerability, doctors in war, and talking about introducing the idea of moral injury and so forth. Yeah.
And that paper made it all the way to the Pentagon, right?
Able to give that course, give that talk at the Senior Medical Officer Leadership course at the Pentagon on several occasions. Not as many as 10, but several.
So has that had any effect that you can think of that they may have Keyed off of
So
that?
I retired in 2013, and so I haven't really kept up with a whole lot of what's going on there. But we were asked to come do a simulation course for the people who were headed over there, and um, I was asked to write the scenarios for the simulation course, and every single one of them had a moral, ethical dilemma built into it that they had to figure out, including like the situation with women. We had actors who were acting that out and presenting that problem for the group to figure out and decide what was going to be their stance, because there was no official stance from the U.S. government on how you're to handle that system.
Well, there
So,
also was one case, as I recall, where one example about this young doctor and an Afghan and a Marine were brought in at the same time. And the question is, which one do you treat?
mhm.
Why don't you run through that real quick problem, which
Well,
also illustrates, some of the problems that they ran into that you weren't expecting.
sure. Well, I'm not sure exactly which situation you're talking about, but it was commonplace that an enemy was brought in at the same time that our troops were brought in, and the Geneva Conventions, which were developed according to Christian morals, say that if you have, you're not really supposed to look at whether they are an ally or an enemy from a medical perspective. You take care of the person who's most seriously injured first, providing the same resources for that sort of a thing. And we did that, even though the Afghans really didn't qualify as prisoners of war according to the Geneva Conventions. They didn't sign the Geneva Conventions, but we still felt that that was the moral, ethical thing to do. So there were times when if we had an injured Marine and an injured enemy combatant, you can't really call them a prisoner of war, they don't qualify for that, but an enemy combatant, we would take the enemy to the operating room first. Um, if they were more seriously injured and it was a higher likelihood that they were going to die. Of course, there were a lot of judgment calls and gray areas like that, and I will say with complete confidence that, to my knowledge, no Marine ever suffered in further injury or loss because of that delay. So it was something that we did because we felt it was the right thing to do. But no one need think that we were discounting the care of our Marines. I would not tolerate that.
Well, I thought that might be a point that might be explained to the folks. Okay, back to the mission side. Sorry for the interruption.
It's all good. Uh, but yeah, anyway, just going back to the mission side of things, people used to be very theologically trained, but now there's just such uh, a lot of the thought from many of the sending agencies is, there are a lot of sick people that need help, and the medics are very well trained in that physical medical sort of thing. We need to not delay them by requiring theological training. Let's get them to the field where they can save lives. And of course, there is some merit to that. I appreciate that. But what you wind up with is, I'll just say, just talk about myself. I knew that my theology of illness, suffering, death, and healing was inadequate for what we were going to encounter. And I was hoping to find someone who would be able to teach me about those things. And I did not find a lot of fruit in finding anybody, even on the mission field, who was able to do that. And we really encountered those sorts of things again. I was well prepared as an emergency medicine doc to do emergency medicine over there. Of course, there are a lot of things that you need to learn, but it was the intercultural, ethical sorts of things that were very difficult because they happened just routinely. And when we weren't prepared for what was going to go on, it adds burden. That moral injury is a cumulative thing. It's a load that accumulates unless you know what to do about it. We weren't just technicians. We had moral and ethical things to play. I just give a couple of examples with that. There was an old man who was brought to the hospital, a grandfather, and he was quite seriously ill. This was early during our term when I was still thinking like an American medic. But he was brought to the hospital seriously ill, and like his our ability to address his illnesses was very small. So the likelihood of him surviving was very low, certainly less than 10%. But the family said, please do everything you can. You know, it's what you hear a lot over here. And so I responded in the way that we would over here. I did what they asked, and we did everything that we could to try to help him. And as expected, he died after a large amount of effort. You know, and so, okay, you know, those things happen, and that was sort of my expectation of it. And I was really horrified to learn later on that this was a poor farming family, and that to pay the bill, which had to be done for his care, they had sold their ancestral land, their farming land that they earned a living from, that they worked a living from. You know, that's where their food came from. They had sold it all to pay for his bills. Um, I had no idea that that's what they were doing. They thought, even though we told them over and over again the likelihood of this is going to be small, they still felt that if we were offering it, that was a legitimate hope. When the truth was, it was a futile effort. That was a bad call on my part. We say here in America that you shouldn't practice paternalistic medicine, you know, but over there, in instances like this, you need to practice paternalistic medicine. You need to be able to tell somebody this effort is going to be futile, and I don't recommend that we proceed. You know, we treat them with dignity. We don't abandon anybody. We treat everybody with dignity, but we don't ask people to basically wreck their potential for future livelihood in something that is not going to bear fruit. So that was one. And another one that was a big problem for a friend of mine just had to do with what he found himself mixed up in. He's a family doc, and he helped a lady deliver twins. And she, when the twins were unexpected, when he went to congratulate her on having twins, she didn't seem all that happy. So, you know, he thought, well, you know, it's an unexpected mouth to feed, but everybody was doing fine, and so he went home. And when he came back to work the next day, there was only one baby. When he asked the nurses, who were all, you know, local nurses, about the second baby, they didn't want to acknowledge that there had been a second baby. And when he dug into it further, he found out that in their culture, when twins were born, the first twin was considered to be a normal and natural baby, and the second one was considered to be a demon that was trying to sneak its way into the world by looking like the first one. And so in that culture, they routinely did away with the second baby. And that's what had happened in the night by his nurses at his mission hospital. So, you know, with a deep sense of responsibility that we have for our patients, especially for, you know, children, especially for babies, that was a big deal for him. And that sort of thing goes on routinely when you're involved in cross-cultural medicine, especially in certain parts of the world. So, you know, there's some parts of that burden that can be avoidable, you know, by sort of redefining what are deeply held moral values for us so that we get to understand them better, which ones are really mistaken and which ones are true and biblical and we should stick to. And there are important ways of learning how to deal with those burdens when they show up. That's one of the things that we're involved with currently. But going back to the beginning and talking about how important it is that we recognize that we're spiritual beings and so forth, this moral injury that I'm describing is not like PTSD. That's a very different entity. PTSD is less of a moral, ethical sort of thing and more of an emotion. It's a more emotional sort of thing. Generally, this is an overgeneralization, but it's related to fear. When someone's been involved in a life-threatening event, whether it's something in combat or a rape or whatever, you know, it can produce PTSD with startle responses and nightmares and that sort of a thing. PTSD is well understood and can be treated with medications and psychotherapy and things like that. Moral injury does not respond to those things in the same way. Medications don't work. Psychotherapy that is largely secular tends not to work because it's more of a spiritual thing. It's about guilt and shame and betrayal. So it's a different entity. It's a spiritual problem, and it requires a spiritual answer because we're spiritual beings. Sometimes I think, especially in the West, we think about guilt and shame and joy and fear and all these sorts of things, and we think about them as being largely unimportant or even like illusions. And that's just not true. Fear is not an illusion. Actually, we're built, hardwired to physically respond to fear, right? You sweat, your heart rate goes up, your pupils dilate, I don't know, all these things, you breathe faster. It is a real entity. And guilt and shame are similar and are really powerful. There might not be able to physiologically see as much. I mean, people may flush if they're ashamed or something like that, and there might not be as many physiological things, but they're very real, and people will do almost anything to avoid shame. You know, that's why blackmail works. If they find something that you're ashamed of, boy, people will fork over a lot of money to avoid being ashamed. It's a spiritual thing, and what you need is forgiveness. If you're guilty or ashamed, you need reconciliation and openness and those sorts of things. And those are, forgiveness is a spiritual thing. So seeking spiritual answers to those things is the answer. In working with the soldiers, many of the psychiatrists have said that the soldiers would complain about forgiveness, about that potential for forgiveness, that the person who could forgive them is dead. And sometimes that's the same with medics. You think that the only person who could forgive you is dead, but the truth is God is the one who can ultimately forgive anything, and he invites us to do that. 1 John 1:9, if you will confess your sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. It's a promise. And so in all of these things, the best answer to this spiritual problem is a spiritual solution. It's a coming back to God. And just going back to the beginning, what could we do about all this stuff? I really believe that the theological preparation for the mission field and also for entering into combat situations, the spiritual side, is so important. We really need to address that and prepare people to encounter that part of it, because if we don't, it ignores one of the most important components of who we are as a human being.
Well, first of all, let me apologize for all the sounds, bird chirping and the sounds. In my normal situation of an outdoor studio, you just got to take that with all of the warts. So I apologize for that. But what are those things that you're involved in now? What are the organizations that you're involved in now to try to rectify some of those situations that we talk about?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm working with a group called medsend.org, MEDSEND, and that's the website, medsend.org. Medsend is an organization that was started to help healthcare missionaries with their educational debt while they're serving, but now we've moved on to helping out with local national medics in other countries as they're training with scholarships and so forth. But my role is working with healthcare missionaries to better prepare them for what they're going to encounter, support them while they're over there, find out what are the ongoing major issues and so forth. So we're writing stuff, speaking about things, engaging in retreats and coaching and mentoring and all of these sorts of things to better support folks while they're over there, because otherwise, just to put it flatly, medical missionaries tend not to last very long on the field before they need to come home.
So the burnout rate's high because they don't know what to expect. Get over there expecting to convert people, and it ain't easy.
It is much, much harder than most people anticipate. If you've lived there, you understand that in one way. But unless you've had those feelings of personal responsibility as a medic, taking care of patients and seeing what can ultimately happen. It really is disorienting even for people who've already lived over there before. Um, so, it's not insurmountable. Boy, there are quite a number of wonderful, heroic healthcare missionaries who've been doing this for 20, 30, 40 years. Um, but they are the ones who've learned those spiritual practices and approaches that help them survive over there. So we're trying to learn from them and help them out. There's a friend of ours, Robin, who's a nurse practitioner. She's one of my heroes from over there. Robin is about to retire after 40 years on the mission field as a single lady, and she spent much of her time working with orphans and kids who were abandoned, and so every one of their stories is really burdensome. It's a terrible story with every one of those kids, but she has learned how to handle that. I think I would be crushed under that kind of a load, but she's learned how to do that. Her relationship with God is strong. She's with Him all the time. She's talking with other grace-filled, like-minded believers on a regular basis. She takes the time away that she needs to. Um, she's really learned how to do those sorts of things, and she told me not long ago that there are a lot of burdens with this. Every story is a tough one, but I have joy in my job every day. Like, wow, more like that, please.
Well, you're working with a lot of organizations, a conglomeration of organizations, really. I think folks like what Samaritan's Purse and several others are joining together, realizing what some of those things are that you're doing needs to be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Samaritan's Purse is a great organization. They're not a formal partner with MedSend, but we work together a lot. But the major, or almost all of the major sending organizations that send medical missionaries are affiliated with MedSend, and we're very grateful for those relationships. In the past, several of those, I'll say, just really didn't recognize the difference between the experience of healthcare missionaries and a Bible translator, for example. And that may seem obvious now that you say it, but until you say it, it might not be apparent. And so the training for a medical missionary was the same as it was for a Bible translator or a church planter. But more and more of them are recognizing, oh yeah, there is a difference, and we need to have a different preparatory and support process while people are serving in those ways. And so there we go. And please understand with this, I'm not saying that one is more or less important or is better or worse than the other. There certainly are plenty of other ministries that are quite burdensome. Saving children out of sex trafficking, for instance, is incredibly burdensome. So I'm not saying that we're, better or worse or even unique in that level of burden, but it is a specific calling that we can help prepare people for.
Well, one other thing, you just finished an article that was published called Boundaries, having to do with boundaries. You may explain that as an example of one of the things that the medical missionaries run into that they really don't understand before they get there.
Sure. Great. Thanks. A couple of mindsets that we're conditioned into here in the U.S. is a very strong sense of responsibility for the outcome of our patients, which is a good thing in a lot of ways, right? You don't want to be fatalistic, oh well, whatever happens. You do want to be diligent in taking care of your patients. But the extent to which that is true can become really delusional, or you really do think you're responsible for the life and death of your patients. And the legal profession would encourage that in some ways. But another conditioning point is that we're taught a very powerful work ethic, an abundant work ethic, where even in training, you're told, okay, you're limited to an 80-hour clinical work week. You're not allowed to work more than 80 clinical hours a week while you're in training. But of course, there's also the studying and all the other sorts of things that you also are going to do in addition to the 80 clinical hours. So when you finish training, that limitation goes away. There are limitations for airline pilots and for truck drivers, but there are no limitations for medics as far as how many hours they can work in a week, which is kind of crazy, I think. But you're taught that while there are patients to see, while there's work to do, you need to do it. Don't go home while there's work to be done. Okay, so you take those mindsets, that sense of responsibility, and that really overabundant work ethic, and take that to the developing world where the line of patients never stops. And they are all sick. You're not getting people coming to you with their sniffles. They're coming with quite sick illnesses, many of or serious illnesses, many of which are life-threatening. And you may be the only medic in the area. When do you stop? How do you justify stopping? You have a family back home, or home with you, and they need you to fulfill your role there. There are other responsibilities. You're supposed to communicate back home with the home organization, with your supporters, and all this other sort of thing. And so the burden to work always, to never stop, is really powerful. Many people feel that they cannot take a Sabbath. I realize that that is one of the commandments, but gee, I can't. How can I justify taking a Sabbath? We hear over and over again, when I don't work, people die. So how do you justify boundaries for your workplace? When people do continue to work like that, almost inevitably they burn out. There are a few people who it seems that maybe the Lord's given them a special dispensation that they can work like that for many years, but most people try and fail and burn out badly. So an important part of what we've been doing is teaching people that if you say it's not Christian to have boundaries, you need to look to what did Christ do. Jesus had boundaries. Jesus sometimes left the crowds to go do something else that he knew was important. He sent the crowds away at times. Sometimes people will point out that Jesus healed on the Sabbath, and that's true. We do have 7 accounts of him healing on the Sabbath in the scriptures, 7, and they're all individuals. We don't have accounts of him healing the crowds on the Sabbath. As a matter of fact, Mark 1 is a great chapter to look at that, because Jesus he healed Peter's mother-in-law on the Sabbath while he was observing regular Sabbath activities. He had been in the synagogue earlier in the day where he had healed an individual or cast a demon out of an individual. And then another appropriate Sabbath activity was taking a Sabbath meal in Peter's house. He healed Peter's mother-in-law. And when evening came, when the Sabbath was over, the crowds came, and he healed the crowds at that point. So he didn't go to work, if you will, on the Sabbath. There were some isolated individuals, but it was not his pattern. And again, there are times when the crowds came to him, and Jesus sent them away. When they wouldn't go, he got in a boat and went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And when they followed him, he got back in a boat and went back to the other side. When it was time, there are times when he healed everybody, and there are times when he left. And so boundaries are absolutely appropriate. And when we are able to convey that sort of thing from a biblical justification, that even the Messiah didn't have a Messiah complex in thinking that he needed to solve everybody's problems, and that it is absolutely Christian to recognize your own limitations, your own God-given limitations, and learn how to live within those. That is freeing for a lot of people. And we're also able to give them examples of many individuals and hospitals and places where they have learned that. They've put it into place, and their attrition rate, if you will, their early departure rate is far lower than places that don't have those sorts of boundaries, where they just feel like you have to work.
So what you're saying is that training, you've got medical missionaries who go over with the idea that they're going to stay 40 years. Mm-hmm. And unless they have those boundaries to limit what their limitations really are, whether most of them come back in within 4 years, is that what you told me one time?
Yeah, that was some of our internal information, that healthcare missionaries tended not to last very long, usually less than a full 4-year term before they came back for good.
Simply because they just burn out.
Burn out. There are a lot of reasons for it, but burnout in our group of people who've gone over, that's the most common reason that people come back earlier than anticipated. Burnout. It's all a big mix, because it's not like anyone has only the issue of overwork. There's also the moral injury that's going on. There's also the conflict within the organization or with other people. There may be medical issues. It's rarely one thing, but that's actually one of the biggest contributors, is that push to burnout.
So netted out, two netted out. You got doctors going over to a combat area to piece those Marines back together, and you've got missionaries going to the field to convert people or to assist in churches and those types of things. But the extraneous things, supposedly, I guess you can say extraneous and pretty important, but those things crop up that they're just not prepared to do, and that's what your function is these days, right?
I would protest extraneous. I think
that was a bad choice.
Well, just that I think that actually when we go over, we think, yeah, okay, those are the incidentals, those are the little things, the little hills that I'll jump over, and we have no idea what they are and what they will do to you, and so it's exactly that. It's those moral, spiritual, theological things that we think are incidentals, are extraneous, that wind up being the main reason that people are struggling. As you believe, so you think, and as you think, so you do. So you got to go back to, what do you believe? If you don't have a good handle on what you believe and direct implications that has for how you live, and you're not ready to go, and it leaves a mark.
Well, we'll leave it there, Sport. Your mama and I are proud of what you're doing, and wish you Godspeed in your missions.
Well, we're grateful, and we just finished Father's Day, and I'm grateful for my father and for all the way that I was raised up and taught and supported and everything else. We are grateful for y'all.
Okay, so with all that, we're going to leave all of the noise and birds chirping and finish it up this time. We're glad you joined with us. I'm Jim Ritchie. We'll see you again next time.